Can you all hear me okay in the back? Yes? Okay, great. Hi, my name is Tyler Taba. I'm the Director of Resilience at the Waterfront Alliance. I will be moderating today's panel. Just wanted to say thanks to everybody for coming out to this panel. This is the Floodgates panel, where we need them, where we don't. Intentionally a kind of a provocative name, and hopefully we'll get to the answer to that question. And so really excited to get this panel started. We have about 50 minutes of panel conversation, and we'll save some time for about a 10-minute Q&A with the audience. So we'll try to go through a lot to cover here. So I mentioned I'm Tyler, I'm the Director of Resilience. I help lead our policy and advocacy work at the Waterfront Alliance around climate resilience and adaptation. A lot of that is around projects that we're seeing across the harbor region that include floodgates. And so I'm really excited to be moderating this discussion with our great set of panelists. And instead of me introducing all of them, I thought I would let them go down and introduce themselves and talk a little bit about and say something about why this panel is important for their work. And so I'll start with Minelly, and then Laurian, and then Philip.
Good morning. Okay, there we go. I was like, I thought we were awake after this morning's intro sessions, which I thought were incredible. So kudos to the Waterfront Alliance for getting those conversations started. My name is Minelly De Coo. I was former Special Assistant to the President for Infrastructure Implementation at the White House, but I have been working on infrastructure implementation, including climate adaptation, resilience, at the federal, at the state, and at the local level. And I'm just really excited for this conversation. Thank you all so much for coming to this session, given all the other incredible topics that are being covered at the same time. I think, this is really a timely discussion, and regardless of, I think this morning's panel really touched on a lot of the challenges at the federal level specifically that are currently going on. But I'm a big believer and have continued to see over, 15 plus years in this industry that the needs don't go away. And I think when you're talking about climate adaptation and floodgates and, flood walls and other flood risk reduction measures, that need will be there. And I think it's on us to be planning and preparing to, basically determine what the best solution is. So I'm really excited about the conversation, and especially to connect with some incredible colleagues also doing this work.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Good morning. I couldn't have said it better. I want to say ditto, but I'll have to add something new to the conversation. My name is Laurian Farrell. I'm the Deputy Commissioner for the Bureau of Coastal Resilience at DEP. And this is a bureau that was created about 18 months ago. So it's fairly new in the grand scheme of bureaus, the city agencies. And we're really still just trying to figure it out. What is it we're going to do to help our communities prepare for these climate threats that we know are here for 520 miles of coastline? And how are we going to build upon the lessons learned in the last 12, 13 years since Tropical Storm Sandy hit, and all of the incredible work that's been done by so many of you in this room to plan, design, and construct coastal infrastructure assets. But we also have to think about what happens when we can't keep all of the water out, and how do we help communities be holistically resilient. And there's no one size fits all. There's no silver bullet. And so floodgates, I am agnostic. I like them and I don't like them. I don't care where we put them. Well, I do. We'll talk about this more, but it's one tool in the toolbox, and trying to think through what's the best balance of use of all these tools is what we're here for. I'm excited to be on this panel today because I expect to learn a lot, and because before 18 months ago, I had never thought twice about floodgates, and now I think about them a lot, all day long, especially since we just took possession as a city of the first set of floodgates along the east side of Manhattan in the East Side Coastal Resilience Project. Johari is here, Mayor Jordan is here, Carrie's here, a lot of people who worked for years to get these things in place. It's now our Bureau of Coastal Resilience task to operate and maintain this new class of assets for the city. So we have 12 floodgates. We're learning about them. Nicholas Chaluka, who's sitting in the back, is our Director of Engineering. He's responsible for making sure we get all the planning for operations in line with our field team. So we literally are in real time learning about these gates and how they function, not on paper, but in real life. And what is it going to take to keep them functioning and making sure that we get out and close them when the time comes. So there's the one part of the operations that I'm interested in, but I'm also interested in figuring out where is a good place to put them next or not. And so with that, I will pass it to Phil.
Thank you, Laurian. I'm Philip Orton. I'm a research professor at Stevens Institute of Technology in Hoboken. My background I'm officially an ocean engineer now, but at an engineering school. So that's one hat that I wear, but another hat based on all my education was physical oceanography, marine science background. So I have kind of the broad understanding of the implications of these new features at our coastline. And they're really important new features, right? In some cases, there's been proposals to change the coastline to where it can be closed off and not include all the interior of an estuary for some brief period of time. So they're huge impactful decisions that can influence estuaries, ecosystems, marshes, and most importantly, well, equally importantly to some people, by protecting people from flooding. So I really hope to ensure by my involvement in these discussions that these decisions are made with a really broad understanding of estuaries and ecosystems and the oceanography involved. And also my expertise in storm surge, which has been one of my primary research topics in the past decade or even 15 years now, is central here. We provide forecasting for water levels with our Stevens Flood Advisory System that are used in some cases to close existing tide gates around the region on Raritan Bay at Keensburg. By New Jersey DEP, they consult our forecasts. Stamford has a storm surge barrier. So these barriers already exist in different parts of the region, and we also inform Hoboken's decisions on when they can pump water against the high or low river water level. So we're really involved already in these decisions, informing what to do. So I'm really excited to be part of this panel too and learn some new things also. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much. Okay, so we got a lot to cover, but before we do that, can everybody who has an open seat next to them raise their hand? Okay, great. Let's start filling in the seats. We'll just pause for a second.
There's one. Good idea.
Very good idea.
Get people into the seats. There's still one up here. Rob, somebody.
Wow, what a popular panel.
Oh, who knew floodgates were so popular?
Yeah,
Well, thank you.
yeah.
We got room
A lot
right
of,
here.
lot of pressure to
Nerding
make
out.
this a good discussion.
Clearly, you didn't see the recent TikTok video. Floodgates are hot.
Yeah, like someone made a TikTok.
The
Yeah.
algorithm did not throw that one out.
Okay, great. So just before we get started, I do want to level set here. This is one of the panels that falls under the technical track for the conference. So there are PDH credits available for this panel. So it will, at some point, get very technical. But before we do that, I just want to make sure that we set the stage for everybody, knowing that not everybody here is an engineer or maybe doesn't even know what we're talking about when we're talking about floodgates. So we'll take a minute or two here and go around maybe and just talk about what it is exactly that we're referring to when we're talking about floodgates. I think for this panel, it'll primarily be focused on gates that open and close in the event of a storm, in the event of a hurricane, and Phil, I think, will talk a little bit more about how they might open in other instances beyond just hurricanes. But what we're not talking about are seawalls and more permanently closed structures that are built on land. That's a part of the projects that we're going to see and that are happening all across the city and the region and the world. But for the purposes of this panel, I think we're really just focusing on floodgates. And so I don't know if anybody else wants to say anything or add anything to kind of level set about what it is we're talking about. I know we have some photos here before we kind of jump in.
Well, we could talk about the photos a little bit. So there are obviously some huge pieces of infrastructure built around the world, and these are just two examples of international examples in the Netherlands and in the UK. What I've learned, there's a really interesting group, ISET, is it ISET? iStorm, yes, thank you. I'm mixing up my acronyms. iStorm is a group of people that work on gates, on large storm surge barriers. And I learned from them that there are no two alike in the world. And so that becomes very interesting when you start to design them, because there aren't a lot of examples. Even though some of these have been in place for decades. That's still they're baby gates in the grand scheme of infrastructure, right? So we're all still learning about them. I guess the big thing about these that you can see is obvious that they're barriers, right? So they control the water in different ways, and your operations decisions have impacts on in different ways on how you can navigate the waters, like ecosystem, and how people experience the rivers themselves, right, or the water bodies. So those two examples were just to show you sort of the scale we could talk about when we talk about gates.
I think we can keep it in the previous one, and I'm happy to do a little bit of kind of just level setting. Obviously, I think the premise here is that, as you know, universally, folks know how to build big things, and I think what you'll see is that in a lot of instances, floodgates specifically are utilized in more urban environments, right, where you may not have the space that you need for, say, kind of easy transitions and elevations with a levee or a kind of integrated seawalls below grade. And I think that that's obviously very key here, both in Rotterdam and in London. The other interesting piece here, to Laurian's point, is that the operations aspects are pivotal to the decisions that get made about whether a floodgate is the actual, the best solution for the environment that you're dealing with. Fascinating stuff, but in Rotterdam, right? These are automated gates, right? That function. Obviously, there are signals that are sent, through technology and data, which we touched on this morning, how important data is, so that they're able to basically stop vessel traffic with enough time to ensure that the gates get deployed correctly. But again, that is another aspect of when we're thinking about, is this the right solution for the right environment that we're dealing with? Again, more often than not, you'll see that gates are big in urban environments, as opposed to maybe some of the other solutions, which I think we'll touch about, especially in the context of New York City.
I guess that's a great segue now to New York City. And so, Laurian, you had just mentioned the new Bureau of Coastal Resilience taking over the operations for the gates at Eastside Coastal Resiliency Project. I think some of these roller gates here, I think, are from the Eastside Coastal Resiliency Project at the bottom here. Maybe.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yep. The bottom we have.
Is that at Astor Levy?
We have Astor Levy around 18, where it says 18, that's a floodgate being installed, a roller gate. And then on the right-hand side here is a swing gate. So both barriers, but slightly different mechanisms. The top ones are a different project, or the top one on the left is flip-up gates, but that's the Brooklyn-Montgomery Bridge project. Yeah. Yeah.
So I guess a question that I get asked a lot that I don't have an answer to, and so I'll turn it to you, are these kinds of projects the model? Is this what's going to be scaled out across New York City? And maybe as you're talking about it, you could mention what floodgates do, what they're designed to do, and what they're designed not to do. And so thinking about, as we scale out climate resilience infrastructure across the city, is this the model that is going to be happening across the city?
Good question. So the easy part is what do they do and what they're not designed to do. You will see, it's hard to see in this picture, but I guess up on the right, on the top corner here, you see a little bit of a flood wall. So if you could imagine, these gates are the mechanism to close off the opening where the walls are. So in New York City, we have designed several miles of flood wall along east side of Manhattan, but we also know that this is not a city where you can just block off access to the waterfront. I don't know what city is, but we've heard very loud and clear that access and our relationship to the water is incredibly important. So we're trying to solve for a problem of coastal storm surge, which is this huge wall of water coming toward us. We want to keep it out in storm times, in gray storm days, but we want to not be the main element of the waterfront. We want people to have access. So the gates allow us to keep openings in those walls, and we have to go and either swing them shut or pull them shut when the time comes. And the exercise for that could be anywhere from 24 to 96 hours in advance of a storm. Again, going back to our conversation
Yeah.
this morning, how important forecasting is
Yeah.
for this operation. But that's it. We're sealing off the city from the water using a series of, in this case, flood walls and floodgates. What they don't do is provide us protections during those smaller events. So if there's tidal flooding, sea level rise, these were not designed for that, although there's some sea level rise elements built into some of the designs in some cases.
Right.
The second part of your question about is this the model for the future, I don't know. And so we have designed quite a few projects along the waterfront that incorporate seawall and gate designs. There are some in Red Hook. There's now Brooklyn Montgomery Bridge. On the west side, Battery Park City Authority has designed some. The question is, can we continue to do that and meet our obligations to maintain and operate? And it's becoming really clear that there is a trade-off. There's not unlimited funds for maintenance, as I'm sure many of you know, and we don't all necessarily have, if we only have, say at best, a 96-hour window to get out and close all of these gates, can we do that if we have 50? Maybe. If we have 100, if we have 200, where's the tipping point where it doesn't make sense anymore, that this no longer becomes a viable, really emergency management response?
Yeah.
So we have to now take a step back, look at what we've designed, what we've built, what the effort will be to maintain and operate, what the risks are involved in that, and then hopefully also think about new emerging technologies and different ways and be open to those new things as they come online.
Yeah. So that's a little, and I think when you talked about the access to the waterfront and and the operations and maintenance, you're talking about some of the financial issues, some of the social issues, but there's also maybe some ecological challenges or opportunities. I don't know. And so, Phil, I think that's where your research really comes in. And you mentioned you've done some modeling and some research on sediment flow and other things around gates and barriers. And so maybe you want to chime in a little bit too on piggybacking off of what Laurian was just sharing.
Sure, Tyler. I ran a project funded by NOAA several years ago where we looked at the environmental effects in estuaries of cross-harbor barriers, cross-estuary barriers. There's two different types of barriers we've been talking about here. One is the waterfront barriers that Laurian was showing pictures of, but then there's also these barriers that could be called tide gates or storm surge barriers in the harbor. Usually the storm surge barriers are the very large ones that are navigable by ships. In the case of the ones in the harbor, there's concerns about their infrastructure when they're not being used, even slowing the tides, reducing the flushing of an estuary. So here's a diagram showing where there's open barrier. On the left, there's no barrier, it's just the natural conditions, and there's a certain amount of tidal flushing of pollutants, things like that. Also fish migration. On the right, the diagram shows a case where there's the infrastructure in the water. The gates are open, but there's still infrastructure that can block something like 40% of the cross-sectional area of that waterway. And so typically the way these are being designed is that there's very little impact on the tides, but it costs a lot of money to do that. You need to have a lot of these movable gates. But that's what the Corps of Engineers has been trying to do. So less infrastructure blocking the tides. But there are unknowns about what happens with migration of species, fish, et cetera. This is from some work that we published on an agenda for estuary research to understand these impacts in a journal called Earth's Future. Next slide. And then also another concern, and a positive on the left is if you don't, well, it's not the positive on the left, if you don't have these barriers, you're gonna get flooded, right? But marshes need to be flooded. So people don't wanna be flooded, but marshes do wanna be flooded. So that's another concern, is that when you do have these barriers and you prevent flooding, then you could prevent some natural erosion and positive processes in estuaries that could lead to marsh growth and marshes remaining healthy under sea level rise and rising with sedimentation. So these are just some of the environmental concerns that still really need to be studied more. The Corps of Engineers has been studying some of these, granted, but definitely more research would be useful.
And there's also something else here that I think maybe you could speak to, which is and I mentioned it at the beginning about the opening and closing of the barriers and the time variance and dependence of that. And you've done some research or have some insight into that as well. Is there anything maybe you
Yeah,
could say?
I mean, one of the biggest challenges with these barriers is that as sea level rises, your daily tides start causing more, or your everyday winter storms start causing flooding in addition to the extreme events. So there is a rise in the frequency that you would need to close the barriers because of sea level rise. And so the Corps had a nice diagram, you can go to the next slide, that shows how the time between closures on the y-axis will shrink over time going into the future. And so initially it may be planned to have a storm surge barrier across Jamaica Bay's inlet, or one of the proposals, or Kilvan Cole, which it leads into the port of Newark and New Jersey. That over time, at first you might only close them once every 5 years during an extreme event, but over time that'll be reduced because sea level rises and you start having more potential floods. It'll reduce to every year or more. And then you'll have to do something different unless you want to keep closing it more and more till it's closed monthly or even daily 50 to 100 years from now. So you have to do something else. And so the first point where the line curves and goes back up is a place where there's been adaptive management. So it's a nice diagram in that it shows, that you have to keep changing your trigger for closure. So initially it would be at 7-foot water level, you got to close the barrier. But if that starts happening frequently, they might change that threshold to be 8 feet, after a foot of sea level rise, for example. And so you keep having to have this adaptive management, but at the very end of the line, it shows, well, maybe in the future that adaptive management will fail. Maybe there won't be funding to raise the shorelines by another foot, or to raise homes by, again, or it won't be politically popular. So there is a danger in the long run, and that's a big concern with these barriers, is that they'll be closed a lot more frequently or even closed permanently, making a lagoon out of a former inlet or estuary.
Thanks, Phil. And we'll come back, I think, to that point. And I want to drill down more on some of the areas that you're talking about in the New York and New Jersey harbor, but also maybe want to take a minute here for Minelly and step back and thinking again about the rest of the country and maybe the world and how floodgates are used. And particularly, maybe let's start in the U.S. and with the Army Corps of Engineers, because that's kind of the context of what we're talking about in the region here, and have done some work across the country. And so I'm wondering maybe if you feel like there's too much of an emphasis on this, like engineering our way out and floodgates being the primary driver of solutions, if that's been like some of the experience that you've seen with projects across the nation. And then, as we know, a lot of us in the room have worked with some of the folks at the Army Corps in the Engineering with Nature team, where they kind of, they have all these books and research on engineering with nature and using nature-based features. And so how have you seen that shape out across the country?
Yeah, no, there's, for every scenario and for every condition around the country, there is a very niche, kind of solution that works, and obviously some that don't. So maybe just to provide some big picture, just framing in terms of the investment that had been done under the Biden administration through the bipartisan infrastructure law, $20 billion overall for water investments and improvements to a lot of water systems, as well as climate resiliency. Again, that's bill, IRA is its own little flavor. But specifically on resilient infrastructure and through the Army Corps of Engineers, which is one of the agencies that I worked really closely with in my previous role, there was $5 billion roughly that was allocated to the Army Corps to implement flood mitigation measures. When you work with the Army Corps, as many of you I know do, there is a nuance with the terminology, right? Whether if you're talking about flood protection and flood risk reduction, because in a lot of times, in a lot of instances, that's really all that they can promise, right? So you'll see, or the money has not, luckily, yet been put at risk as much as kind of the FEMA brick, risk that the city is dealing with that money being kind of being clawed back, but. The Army Corps is still pushing forward, and that $5 billion, roughly $2.5 of that billion was for coastal flood protection measures, and the other $2.5 was for inland flood protection measures. And again, when you're looking at these investments on a national level, what you'll start to see is really, and you start to peel the layers, and I would always get asked, is like, why is this project so much more expensive than it was, originally planned? And we're like, well, this project has been in the works for over a decade, and the price of things changes, but also through the Army Corps process, and again, many of you are familiar with this, the cost-benefit analysis that really informs this, kind of the decision-making, along with a lot of the drainage investments that need to be made when you are building this type of infrastructure, really start to drive the cost. Obviously, you're also, again, dealing with area, right? So in places where you might have a lot of land to work with, for instance, one of the largest projects that the Army Corps finally got moving after over a decade of planning was Fargo-Moorhead flood diversion project in North Dakota and Minnesota. And this was a project that had been stalled, due to the lack of funding. But really, after getting over $400 million in bill funding for a total project cost of over $700 million, the project is finally on its way. And this was actually a really innovative approach to delivery and implementation. They were able to partner in the Army Corps' first ever public-private partnership to implement this project, and really, I think, cementing, and I think to some of the instructions and the charge that we got this morning from our conversations is we need to start to find innovative ways to implement, innovative ways to deliver, because again, these needs, these risks do not go away. So so much of the work that's happening now is really kind of laying that foundation, and you'll start to see, and again, I know many of you are familiar, you're seeing this type of investments, and again, the Army Corps is a special arm of the federal government, where the Army Corps is actually the one implementing, as opposed to just being the funding arm. So you'll see, you'll see these types of investments all around. We also, I was intimately connected with San Joaquin Valley, also in California, also flood risk reduction, and this was really for a farming community that was kind of getting impacted over and over again. And again, this was inland flooding. And then we have our flavor of coastal investments, whether we're talking about obviously the Northeast, but also in Miami, along the Gulf of Mexico, and all of those investments that are continuing to move forward. So all that to say that we know how to do this work, right? And I think it's on us to figure out how do we best prepare these projects to actually be ready to be implemented when the time is right and when the money is at the table, right? And that includes getting through those tough early, kind of planning phases, including the cost-benefit analysis, including determining what the right solution is long-term for these communities, and not just kind of like the immediate, we know that the one-size-fits-all just does not apply here.
I really appreciate that, and I had a nice little segue. I wanted to talk a little bit about the financing and funding, and before moving into our next question, but I just got a Q&A starting in 1 minute somehow. I have no idea how that happened, so I gotta rush through and go back to the questions that we haven't got to yet. So I just want to ask maybe one more question for Laurian and for Phil to answer, and that is coming back down to New York and New Jersey and into some of the work in research and practice that you're working on. What factors, if you could talk about what factors might be important to deciding where in-water gated barriers are built, where is there maybe more space along the shoreline to think more creatively and differently about projects that don't have to necessarily be so built up, and where might flood barriers be the only option, which is kind of the point of the panel, where floodgates where and where not. And so maybe if you want to try to take a stab at that question.
I'm not going to answer your question. I'm going right back to funding and financing.
Okay.
But I'm going to wrap it together.
Okay.
Because the reality is here, we are not going to build any of this stuff if we don't figure out the funding and the financing. And I know that many people have very strong opinions for or against storm surge barriers, where or where not they should be. I guess my message today is we have a little bit of time to have the conversations, to come to agreements about what the answer to that question is.
Yep.
It is not decided yet by any means. And we have time because we don't have the money to pay for this. And it is not a technical challenge, to Minelly's point. I mean, we can design, we can study, we can get the ecology, we can figure out the science piece. I'm confident about that. In our community, we can do this. The Army Corps project is a $52 billion project, and the Army Corps is funded $9 billion a year nationally. So the chances of New York City getting our money anytime soon to do
Yeah.
this work is very small.
Yeah.
We must find new mechanisms to implement. We have to make smart choices. We have to think about not just building them, but what the UK is going through right now is, their thing is coming to the end of its design life. What do we do with it now? So we also have to think about the future and the longevity of these things when we put them in. So we have a lot of work to do still. And I guess the simple answer to your question is I really believe it, but it depends on what the communities want and risk tolerances in each of these hydraulic zones, hydraulic areas, and then balance that with what we can afford to build holistically resilient communities. And there's a lot of different ways to get there. So this is one of our tools, as I started by talking about at the beginning.
Yeah.
Right. But to me, I spend as much time these days thinking about the financing of this work as I do the technical side.
Laurian couldn't have said it better. I'll leave it at that. So we have 10 minutes for
Amazing. Okay.
Q&A.
So Q&A. And does anyone have any questions? You can raise your hand. I can try to call on you. I don't know if we have a mic floating, Jake. Do we?
It's a small room.
It's a small room. Okay.
Oh,
So.
there is a mic.
There's a
Oh,
mic.
there's a mic. Okay, great. So maybe just if folks want to raise their hand to ask questions, we have about 10 minutes.
Just on the technical side, is this like are the gates type of thing where if you put one on the west side of the coast of Manhattan, you have to put one on the east side of New Jersey as well? Is that like a ricochet effect with the water, or?
The question is about if you put a gate somewhere, does there have to be another gate next to it? Is there a ricochet effect?
There can be increased water levels outside of a protected area. So yes, there can be it's very site dependent. The closer you are to the open ocean, the more likely that water just is spread out over an infinite area. But once you go up a river, Mississippi River is the most famous place where they'll build levees and it'll cause higher flood stage somewhere upstream or downstream, and so that's a big concern. But yes, sometimes, and that's generally planned for. One place I've been studying is Jamaica Bay. We are quantifying how nature-based solutions in Jamaica Bay versus having a storm surge barrier at the inlet changes the way the flood reflects. If you can have enough nature-based solutions, which tend to have less protection, unfortunately, they don't reflect a wave, they spread it out. Much like green infrastructure in a city when there's a heavy rain event, that you can spread out the flood wave and make it not be so high. Whereas when you build a surge barrier, then you do get an extra meter or so of water around Coney Island. That's accounted for in the HAT study as having higher barriers, levees and things around those other areas. But that can also block sight lines and be a negative. So.
I will also just throw in there to Phil's point, it is very site dependent. Specifically for the East Side Coastal Resiliency Project, we actually analyzed that just as a concern, and part of the team is actually here, and was determined specifically whether it was going to have additional risks on a Brooklyn Queens side, and was determined that it was minimal, and again because it was spread over such a wide area.
I saw a hand also somewhere over here. Sam? There's a mic coming.
Thank you, everyone, very much for this panel. Just want to point out one of the things I think we heard from everyone on the panel, which is that there's still a lot of unknowns, and we just don't know what to do. And there's been a lot of, as Laurian, you mentioned, there's strong feelings on both sides of whether we should not be putting anything in the water or not. Laurian, I know you've been out to the UK, as have my team and I, and the way their approach for replacing the current Thames barrier is they have an initiative called Thames 2100, and they're still determined. They've determined that they don't know enough about sea level rise in particular to make a decision, but what they're doing right now is they're doing the research, and they have like different potential pathways. So is that the approach that New York City is taking as well? It seems like nothing has been ruled out. Some of my colleagues believe strongly that an outer harbor barrier, which would shorten the coastline and protect all the 500 plus miles of the city, but also a lot of another 500 miles basically of New Jersey and up the Hudson, that's the only way to protect everyone, if our goal is to protect everyone from flooding. But would you say that that is the approach New York is taking, similarly to developing these different potential pathways with a hope that in the future, I think the UK is determined by 2045, they'll make a decision whether they're going to build an even bigger barrier further down the Thames towards the opening to the where the surge is coming in. I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I believe that is a good way to go. We're not there yet in our planning. The UK team is a decade ahead of New York City in terms of their thinking on this, or more, because they've actually had storm surge barriers to think about. We are just embarking on our comprehensive coastal planning now, and I think that's probably the way it's going to go, because really we're going to need to be opportunistic when it all comes back to funding.
Yeah.
But it'll be, here are our choices that we can make. What can we afford to do? In the interim, how do we utilize the dollars we have to maximize our risk mitigation with a sight for the future? How do we not build something today that precludes us from building something more robust in the future when the opportunity comes? And hopefully that we get out of the disaster response recovery cycle, so we're not dependent on the next big storm to have those dollars flow, but we can convince people that the risks are real now and we need to start investing. But I think it is realistically the way we need to be heading toward, have these scenarios and choices set up.
I think we have time for 2 more questions.
I think this is a question for you, Laurian. You said something about trying to find out from the communities what their risk tolerance is and what they would accept. Is there any realistic way to do that, given the complexity of the technical issues, the unknowns, and the complexity of New York City, and the large spatial scale of the number of different communities that are going to be affected by one of these projects?
Yeah, it's unrealistic to say we will come to a consensus,
Yeah.
right? But the starting point is going out and listening and hearing the different voices. And then I think as experts in the room, we're going to have to make some tough choices and present a few scenarios, and then it will come down to opportunistic funding. So I think there's a path that we have to follow, and I get that often you go to the community and they're not equipped yet to even have the discussions because they're so technical on some levels. But we are going to do the communities a disservice if we don't invest the time to get them equipped. And I have this dream where some philanthropic organization, and I've talked about this last year, some philanthropic organization funds people like Philip to go and support communities in having conversations with us in the city so that we can actually engage in a dialogue and they have their own experts at the table, their own advocates to help them and to be voices. Because as a city, as you know, those of you who've ever worked with or in a city, we are just so busy. We just don't have breathing room to even think about picking up the phone one more time or answering those emails. But like we've got to get this together. These problems are enormous and so complicated. And what we don't talk about is the temporal solutions, like the time limit to the solutions we're talking about today.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, we can build something and save a community for 50 years. Or we can develop up a wetland. The wetland is also at risk of sea level rise and peril and needs room to retreat. And these moving parts are so crazy. I could go on and on and on, but I think the answer is, let's be realistic. We're not talking about utopia, but we have to do something differently than we've done traditional city planning.
Yeah. I like that point you made about connecting communities with academics and researchers. And I'll give a shout out. I don't know if Pamela Pettyjohn is here in the audience, but Coney Island Beautification Project did that to some extent through some work with Cornell University, and doing some community planning around issues of flooding and other things in Coney Island. And I know there's a couple people from the board of Coney Island Beautification Project. So more of that, I think, is really great. I know Ray has a question, and then Paul has a question, so we'll try to go quick.
So my question is about the challenge with the funding, and have there been any studies with the storm protection that possibly
incorporates energy capture or something that could be done. We had the verdant energy turbines on the East River, and we dam rivers all the time for energy. And is there a solution, or have there been studies where if you're coupling 6, 8, 10 barriers, could we also encourage energy capture to help pay or find ways to get funding for this type of infrastructure?
You know, I vaguely recall, and somewhere in the recesses of my brain, a hearing about that has been studied. Have you heard?
Well, I've heard about it with wave attenuation, and people are talking about it as a potential, wave energy generation when you're reducing wave impacts. I haven't heard about it for storm surge, but it may be out there.
Yeah, worth looking into.
Thanks. To get.
So could the panel talk about the relative frequency of the different sorts of flooding risks that we face, storm and wind-driven flooding as opposed to pluvial flooding from heavy rainstorms, which I understand is a more frequent risk, and as a consequence, perhaps the relative merits of investing in storm barriers and inland flood attenuation, such as cloudburst programs?
To be fair, that was one of the questions that we didn't get to. So thanks, Paul.
I will go last on this. I feel like I've been talking a lot.
Well, I could go first about the coastal flooding. There's at least one neighborhood in New York City that's flooded about 100 times per year right now. I won't even name it because they've been picked on enough, and they suffer through that, and they adjust their daily schedule, and they have to move cars out of the way all the time. And then there's extreme event flooding, and that's the other terrible thing that happened with Sandy, and again happened a couple years ago, December 23rd, 2022, I think. There was a severe flood, mainly around Jamaica Bay area, that caused 3 feet of flooding in some neighborhoods. But then so that's one side. It's more the coastal flooding. I'm not as familiar with the rain flooding side. Well,
do you want me to go?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so my background is actually in stormwater management, and so I'm always looking over the cubicle. What are you guys working on over there at DP? But when I started this work 18 months ago, I would go around around my meet and greets, and I kept hearing from everybody. We used to think our problem was coastal, was Sandy, but now we know it's Ida, and the reality is it's both. And so we can't just say, oh, this is the flavor of the day challenge. We have to solve for all of. We also have to solve for economic downturns, for health pandemics, for cybersecurity attacks. Like, all of these things matter in the same city and with the same pot of money. So in order to address really frequent and really devastating rainfall events at the same time as coastal storm surge events, we have to figure out a way to build our projects together and optimize the use of our funding in these construction projects and in our design. And they have to speak to each other, and we have to understand water systems and how, so I understand that Sandy didn't drop a lot of rainfall on the city, but the next storm might be a combined rainfall wave event.
Yeah.
So we have to plan for that as well. We have to think about, when we build these walls and gates, that we're not blocking water in and creating bathtub effects, that the drainage is going to work great during a flashy storm event, a convective event, and that we can also account for the wave coming in the next time. So, the answer to your question, I think, is we have to be just really smart about the risks and not work in silos and think about combinations.
And I would just add one piece to this, and I think this was a little bit of a broken record in several of my previous roles, which is no decision is a decision. And I think as leaders in your industry, but also at the government level, city, state, and beyond, you actually have to start to take meaningful steps to advance some of these solutions, right? And I think sometimes we get bogged down by the magnitude of the problem. But challenges like inland flooding, like rain, and the fact that a lot of our ecosystems are just not built to capture that volume, really requires us to act now, and to act while we are developing, doing real estate development, doing, rezonings, and investing in green infrastructure, again, the solutions exist, and I think we just really need to start getting more creative about how we tackle them, and not get necessarily bogged down by the massiveness, because it's only a matter of time. It's only a matter of time before somebody's going to look at and dust off, the HAT study and say, like, should we be, investing private dollars in this as well? Because there is, energy to be captured and heat to be captured from, these mechanisms. And, we just really need to start taking those steps forward.
Okay, I think with that, we're going to close it out. So I want to thank our panelists so much for this great conversation. Thank you all for being a part of this discussion. I think we have a break now for 20 minutes or so. I don't actually know, but there is a break at this point. And so feel free.
I don't know.
Oh, it's lunch. There's a lunch
yeah,
now
it should be
happening.
lunch.
Wow.
Lunch.
I work here, by the way. So